Okay. Would the clerk call the meeting to order, please?
Yes, good afternoon. Chair Niss, Mayor Filseth,
Here, sitting in for Chair Niss.
Councilmember Koo. Here. Councilmember Tanaka. 3 present.
Thank you. And so thank you all very much for, this is, I think, the first policy and service meeting of the year.
Yes.
All right. And thank you all for joining us. I want to thank Adam and Carol very much from the VTA for joining us this evening and coming up here on a rainy night. And so much appreciated. Thank the members of the public for joining us as well, and the city staff. So we only have one action item on the agenda tonight, which is a presentation from the VTA. However, by procedure, we ask for if there anybody has anything, oral communications, anything to talk about not related to the VTA item that we have tonight, please submit a card now. Is there anybody like that? Seeing none, we'll move on to our first action item tonight, which is the draft 2019 New Transit Service Plan from the VTA. Thank you very much. You have the floor.
Okay, well, thank you for having us. In advance of this presentation, the city was very helpful by sending us a letter with a number of questions based on your interests, and a lot of them pertained to VTA's financial status. So I'm lucky to have Carol Lawson, who is our fiscal resources manager and my go-to person for every budget question, here with me tonight. So we're going to start our presentation off talking about VTA's budget situation.
Thank you, Adam, and I will try to make sure I speak up. This first slide is really kind of the crux of the situation here. This shows our FY18 adopted and FY19 adopted budgets, and at the time, the projections for 2021 and 22. So the kind of bluish bars on the left are the revenues. The gray bars on the right are the expenses, and then the piece above that is the amount of local monies that we need to fund the capital part, or the local part of our capital program. So basically keeping our assets in a state of good repair. So if you total the straight operating minus revenues and the local share of capital need value difference there, you see that the total deficits here are between $50 and $60 million. Oops, wrong button. Escape. There we go. Yeah, take that away from me. Thank you. So ultimately, the reason and the underlying problems here, if you will, is that on the revenue and expense side, our expenses have been growing faster than revenues. Our sales tax growth, while it is still growing, the rate of growth has slowed. Over 80% of VTA's revenues come from sales tax-based items. Going back to the state of good repair and those $30 million chunk that I was showing there in every year, we don't have a dedicated local revenue source for capital expenditures for our state of good repair. It has to come from the same sources, those same exact sales taxes that fund our operating budget. So that is contributing also. Previously, those capital expenditures had been funded from surpluses and capital reserves, but those reserves have been depleted to basically zero at this point. So at the time the budget was adopted, there were several board members that expressed well-founded concern that this difference between revenues and expenses was not sustainable. So as a result of that and some other activities, in January of 2018, the board chair formed an ad hoc financial stability committee to look into what we could do to basically solve this problem. The committee met over the months of March through November, and in December brought to the board recommendations in 3 basic areas. One was specific actions, and one of those actions was to revisit our service delivery levels at and make them a more sustainable level. The other specific actions that were taken by the board at that time was to look at indexing our fares to inflation, and then also offering a voluntary retirement program to a select number of members of the agency that are eligible. The encouragement and policy discussions, I'll just kind of go over a few of them, just things that we need to look at in general throughout the county and what we can do to make sure we're financially stable, looking at revisiting our capital expansion plans, not expanding when you may not have money to operate them when they're done, look at our partner agreements, developing some framework for the future funding of those agreements, looking at job housing balance and other items where we could look to see where we could make some policy changes perhaps that could help with the financial stability. The further examination included things such as trying to identify additional funding sources that maybe aren't as volatile as sales taxes. There are some options, but a lot of them would require state legislature action, and even ultimately would still require a 2/3 majority vote of the potentially. So where we ended up with those recommendations is, again, the starting target was that $50 to $60 million. In the meantime, since the budget had been adopted, SB 1 was upheld, and so we get about between $23 to $27 million a year from SB 1 and STA money, State Transit Assistance money, that had not been included in the budget because at the time SB 1 had just been passed. There was uncertainty whether it would remain, and so it had not been included. So that goes towards solving part of that deficit. The other thing that has happened is in the summer of 2018, the Supreme Court ruled about the ability to collect sales taxes for online purchases, which we believe will have an impact of roughly $5.5 million of additional sales taxes that we will start receiving. So taking those two items that had happened just in the meantime, basically additional revenues, that left us with a $25 million gap that we were trying to fill. And the board authorized that $25 million to come from changes in service delivery, which is what Adam will speak to today. I spoke about the fares previously. That's estimated to bring in an additional $2 million. The voluntary retirement incentive is estimated at $1 million. And then other cost savings and operating efficiencies, some of which will require negotiated bargaining agreement changes. So that would allow us to have a basically balanced budget, which is what we will be going forward with in our 20 and 21 budgets coming up for approval in June. One of the questions that was asked in the letter that we were provided in advance that Adam referenced was the question of how long do we anticipate our insecurity to persist. In the short term, we believe we definitely have, are taking steps to make sure that we have a balanced budget. The reality is, because 80% of our revenues are from sales taxes, we're always going to be susceptible to the volatility of the economy. There are things that you can do and that we have done to try to mitigate that. We have a sales tax stabilization fund reserve that is a set aside of assets to in case of major changes in sales taxes. That's helpful. We also have an operating reserve. Our goal is 15% of budget. We're currently sitting between, I think, 7% and 8% because we've had deficits the last 2 years. So it's eaten into those reserves. We're no longer at the 15% level. But we do have some things in place that when there are changes in the economy, we can weather the short-term storms, but we were not in a position to weather the fact that that expenses were growing so much faster than revenues. So at that point, I think I'll stop with the cheery financial situation, and if we want to go into, we could go with questions on that, or go into the service changes.
Why don't you proceed and finish?
Okay.
Okay, so I'm Adam Berger. I'm a senior transportation planner at the Valley Transportation Authority, and my role is to be I'm one part of the team that designs our transit service plan. So that's the document that determines where the routes go, how frequently they operate, which days of the week they operate, how many hours of the day they operate, and that's what we're talking about tonight. When Carol talked about service delivery and looking for almost $15 million, she's talking about the public transit service plan and finding the savings there. So I want to start this discussion by asking you to step into my shoes as a service planner and thinking at a high level about what the purpose of public transit is. And this is seems like an easy question, but it's one that has a lot of different answers, and different answers that pull us in different directions as transit service planners. On the one hand, we are asked to achieve what we call the ridership goal, which is to think like a business and try to carry as many people as possible. And when you have a fixed budget, that means maximizing the riders you carry per dollar spent. And when you take that sort of outlook into designing a transit system, metrics like boardings per hour and the subsidy per boarding become sort of your North Star for how you make decisions. But there's another side, which we call the coverage goal, and this says that you should take more of a social service mindset toward designing transit service, where what matters most are the people that have access to transit and that we will accept, making sure that we serve vulnerable folks, even if it means that we're going to spend more to do so and we're going to carry less people overall. And these are both very good things to try to achieve. The difficulty is that they pull us in opposite directions. When we focus on the ridership goal, it leads us to design transit networks that have few routes, but many of them that are frequent. And when you design a network with the coverage goal in mind, you get a lot of routes, but because you're spreading your resources over so many routes, it ends up getting spread thinly. So there aren't that many that are frequent. And frequency is a real key thing to understand here, because frequency is a major driving factor of transit ridership. When we have frequent service in dense walkable places, we can get big returns on that investment. Of course, it means you're waiting less for the bus or train to arrive. It means that if you're going to make a transfer to another frequent route, that transfer will have a short wait and be predictable, and it sort of serves as a backstop for reliability. If something happens, if the bus breaks down, having a frequent route means the next bus will be along in not too much time, which means you have to allow less extra time in your day for a transit trip. So when we are faced with this question, the direction we ask from our board of directors is to tell us how much VTA should spend toward each of these goals, how much to ridership and how much to coverage of our total budget. And we look at this as a ratio. So, for example, our current transit service plan, which was designed back in 2008, employs a 70-30 ridership coverage balance. 70% of our budget spent on ridership purposed routes and 30% spent on coverage purposed routes. In 2017, when we were anticipating that BART service would begin at the end of 2017, we adopted the Next Network plan, and some folks may remember that or may have been involved in the process. At that point, our board of directors was asking us to move more in the ridership direction to an 83-17 balance. And the goals of that plan were to, of course, increase ridership, but also to connect to BART and become more cost-effective as an agency. And that plan was adopted with what would be a $15 million increase in the operating budget. Now, since that time, our BART project has been delayed. We're now estimating that it would begin in November or December of this year. And in that time, as Carol mentioned, our financial outlook has become less optimistic. So in December, our board of directors asked us to design a new transit plan, to scrap the Next Network plan, or rather revise the Next Network plan so that we could deliver something similar to it, but at a $15 million decrease in cost. They also said do that at a 90-10 ridership coverage balance, so an even greater shift in the ridership direction, and they asked us to protect access to transit riders who live in South County. So that was in December. I take it more discussion on South County is requested. So I will not question the wisdom of our board of directors, but I think what they were going after is that in South County, where there's not that much transit service right now, and where the service that exists is generally infrequent, removing some of those routes would mean that some people were completely without access to transit, and that would be pretty devastating. Rather, they would like to see us make our trimmings in the next network plan from places where other alternatives exist for accessing transit. Now, we do...
Please proceed. Let's go.
Okay.
I'd like to let it get through there.
Yeah, really.
We can see the whole thing at once, and then we can come back and pick it apart.
So in December, our board of directors gave us direction to design a new plan that fits within these goals. And at the time, they did not understand what we were actually going to propose. They're not transit service planners. So when we came forward with a plan in January, it was a surprise to them. And because of this timeline that we have to be able to implement this plan by November or December to meet BART, we had very little time to really discuss it and analyze it internally. So in January, we were out in the public with this new plan, and it's a draft plan. We are asking for public feedback on this. We're asking for city feedback on this. The team that designs this plan, we're all regular transit riders, but we don't ride every single route. And so we rely on information from our riders and from our municipalities to help direct us toward better ideas and let us know how people are going to be specifically affected by some of the changes that are proposed. And we've been out since January 14th with a public process. February 28th, later this week, is the close of that process. So that's the last time that folks can submit comments. On March 1st, we will start developing a final service plan where I anticipate we'll make several changes based on the feedback that we've received. We've already received 1,200 comments and are actually learning quite a bit from them. It's been very helpful. In April, we plan to release the final plan. We'll ask our VTA committees to review it and give us input, and then go to our May Board of Directors meeting, hopefully for adoption. If that happens, we'll be right at work preparing for implementing the plan to coincide when BART service begins late in 2019. So when you're a transit planner and you're asked shift from 70-30 to shift to 90-10, we look at charts like these. Now this is every VTA bus route organized, ordered in terms of productivity. Productivity is a measure of boardings per hour. On the left, you have our routes that have high productivity, that are in a very healthy state, and on the right, you have our routes that have low productivity, low boardings per hour. Now, we have a 15 boardings per hour minimum standard at VTA, where we'd like to have all of our routes above that, and routes that fall below that should be considered for some sort of modification or potentially to be discontinued if they can't reach that standard. I've highlighted a few routes on there that are in Palo Alto where a change is proposed. All-day routes in blue and express routes in red. So the other side of the coin of bus boardings per hour is the subsidy per boarding that VTA provides per route. That is how much it costs to carry each passenger on that route. On the left side, again, you see the routes that have high rates of ridership, so therefore the subsidy is spread over many riders and ends up being very low. And on the right, it's the opposite, where we're spending a lot per rider. Our most efficient route comes in at around $6, and our least efficient comes in at $94 per passenger, per boarding, I should say. So we are not just robots programmed to think about people as numbers. There is a great deal of consideration that goes into thinking about vulnerable populations. And as staff, we do our best to minimize people losing access to the extent possible. But we are faced with a budget reality and some pretty firm direction from our board of directors, and we're doing our best to balance both of those. I've listed there some of the vulnerable groups that we give particular consideration to. Student seniors, low-income disabled, and our paratransit users. If we shrink our bus network, that means that fewer people will have access to paratransit as well. So we want to think about what our changes mean to those riders. So I'll walk through the changes that are proposed in Palo Alto. Right now, Route 35 travels from the Stanford Shopping Center through downtown and over to the San Antonio Transit Center, with most of its way along Middlefield Road. There's another route, Route 32, that starts at the San Antonio Transit Center and goes to the Santa Clara Transit Center. We are planning to combine both of those routes into a new route we're calling Route 21. So it'll be a similar service that folks on the 35 experience today, but if they're traveling past the San Antonio Transit Center, they no longer have to make a transfer. So it'll still be a 30-minute frequency service. We had proposed to extend the hours on this in the evening on weekdays from 9:30 to 10 p.m. for the next network plan. With this direction to reduce costs, we're proposing to keep them at 9:30, just like they are today on Route 35. For Route 22, this is our only route that operates for 24 hours. It's the only route in VTA's system that operates between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. And as a result, during those 3 hours, it bears the entire overhead cost of our dispatching office, of our sheriff's contracts, and our security costs. We have private security guards at the Palo Alto Transit Center and Eastridge Transit Center, all supporting that route. So the cost per rider for those hours is substantially higher than it is during the middle of the day. And since we're being asked to carry more people per dollar spent, we've come up with this recommendation to discontinue service. But there's another side to this proposal, which we are thinking a lot about, which is we know that about 40 to 50 individuals every night take to this bus route because it's a warm, safe, non-judgmental place, and they use it for shelter. They'll generally ride back and forth about 90 minutes at a time, boarding multiple times in the evening. And as an agency, we are really getting more and more invested in trying to be a solution to homelessness. And of course, this proposal would mean more people could be out on the street. Last week, we met with about 20 social service providers who are specifically focused on homelessness to try to figure out how VTA can be a partner in addressing this issue. We're thinking now about perhaps if there are properties that VTA owns that could be used for micro-housing. All of those ideas are being considered and are in their infancy at this point. But whether this proposal stays in the plan or whether it gets taken out and this service continues, VTA is re-engaging on the issue of homelessness, and we're going to be doing all we can to try to help those folks who use our bus for shelter to find a better location for shelter at night. For Route 88, this is a route that goes from the neighborhoods in northern Palo Alto down to the Gunn High School area and VA Hospital. We run Route 88 all day, and we put extra buses doing slightly different routes, 88L and 88M, on there to pick up Gunn High School students. Gunn High School students make up the majority of the ridership on this route. In fact, it has a very odd route profile. When Gunn High School students are on the buses are packed. And when the school bell isn't about to ring or has recently rung, the buses are quite low in ridership. Here's what it looks like in the southbound direction. You see the students going from the residential area in the north down to the school in the south. Those trips that are shaded in pink are very healthy ridership, and those are the trips that we're proposing to keep, Route 88, 88L, and 88M. And in the evening, you have a similar dynamic. Now, Gunn High School has 4 different weekday schedules, and so we've customized when our buses come by to time with the school. We work with the administration closely on that. But you see, again, we're filling up 3 buses pretty well, and those shaded-in bars are the routes that we propose keeping in the new service plan. I want to talk about Route 89. This route goes from the California Avenue Caltrain station down to the VA hospital. We did not propose any changes to this route in the next network plan, nor are we proposing any now, but I've received a number of public comments with folks saying, please save Route 89. I just want to state that this isn't planning to go anywhere. And lastly, I want to talk about the express routes. This is a class of service that VTA operates on weekdays in the morning and evening peak periods. These are directional services that start in a residential area and carry folks to work. Generally, they travel around, make a few pickups, spend a long distance on the freeway, and then drop folks off in employment areas. Now, to our riders, these are very well appreciated routes, and we recognize that. But one of the things that probably a lot of folks don't realize is that these are very cost inefficient for us. Since these buses are moving for only about 3 hours at a time, we end up having to hire someone for just 3 hours, and it's very difficult to get someone to report to work if they're only going to be paid for 3 hours. So we end up paying them for 8 hours just to get that 3 hours of work out of them. And within that 3 hours, they spend a lot of that time not actually carrying passengers. That time is spent moving from the bus yard to the start of the route, or maybe after they've finished their trip, they drive back to the start of the trip to do it again. About 40% of that time, they are not actually moving passengers, and that compares to 8% on our all-day routes. So for that reason, we end up paying for 8 hours of work, even though only about 90 minutes to 120 minutes is public serving. So that makes those routes very expensive on a per passenger subsidy basis. And the additional inefficiency is that since this service exists on top of VTA's all-day service, we have to purchase, store, and maintain a bus that we only use for a few hours a day and only on weekdays. So to give you a sense of the subsidies, I have the 5 express routes that serve Palo Alto there listed in the rows, and our system average is about $8.40 per route. And on these express routes, we're spending 3, 4, 5 times per passenger to carry folks, essentially saying that those express riders are worth 3, 4, or 5 times as much as a rider on our regular system. And we're thinking that this simply, when we're in the mode of decreasing cost, is too much to bear, and the opportunity to carry more people with that money makes sense for us to shift to a more all-day, more ridership-oriented route. So the proposal is to discontinue Express Route 101 and discontinue Express Route 182, and to decrease the number of daily trips on routes 102 and 103. There's another route, Express 104, that we are not proposing changes to at this time. This starts in East San Jose at the Penitencia Creek area. It would travel up to the Milpitas BART station and then over to Palo Alto. With BART coming, we expect that there may be a large increase in ridership on this route, so we're holding off on making any recommendations till after we see some data on how ridership on this route may change. Route 522, this is actually an increase in service. This is the rapid 522 route that travels down El Camino from the Palo Alto Transit Center to downtown San Jose and then the East Ridge Transit Center. This is one of the most frequent routes in our system, and we're seeing ridership growth on it. So the proposal is to increase the frequency later into the evening. So we'll be 15 minutes or better service for the entire time that this is in operation, 7 days a week. In the letter that you sent us, you asked us to quantify how much money we would save from all of the changes that are occurring or partially occurring in Palo Alto. So I've totaled that up here. We're proposing to save about 7,000 service hours, which would amount to about $630,000 in savings of our $15 million total. I'll note that these hours are not limited to Palo Alto, but rather include all of the jurisdictions in which these routes travel. If I had to estimate, I would guess that these routes spend about 20% of their hours in Palo Alto, which means about $120,000 reduction in the service specifically in Palo Alto, which is less than 1% of the entire service reduction that VTA is proposing in this plan. So nearing the end, a transit planner like me should not be given the full responsibility for deciding who gets and who does not get transit service. I'm looking to citizens and looking to our municipal partners to help give me guidance on this. In my role, what I do is I take that information and I use it to advocate making changes to the final plan to our board of directors. So I would very much welcome input from anyone here tonight, and especially the city. If you write a letter to VTA's board of directors, it's a great way to elevate your comment among all of the ones that we receive. And anybody can visit our project website at newtransitplan.vta.org and comment there, or you can email us at our community outreach office, and I've got the address up there. So that's my last slide. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for this detailed and lucid presentation. I think what we will do is go to the public for comments and then return to the committee for questions and comments. And so, how many people do we have? I have a handful of cards here, and so does that include these?
That's all of us.
That's all of us. Okay. So we have a handful of people, and so you'll have 3 minutes. And the first speaker will be Winter Dellenbach.
Because I have questions, and then I have comments. So, some questions.
Could you turn your mic? Love the mic.
So some questions I have, and then some comments I have. But some questions I have is on the gun lines, I looked at the map, and I don't understand that the 4 pickup in the afternoon gun lines, if they go all the same place, they don't travel all the same routes, the 4 afternoon lines? They all go different routes?
There are 3 variants to Route 88, and they are all slightly different.
So there are 4 pickups, but there are 3 variants of the 4 lines.
3 lines picking up at different times on each weekday.
I don't understand that. I'm sorry. I don't want to take more time. You're allotting me time, and I don't understand the question. And so somebody will explain at some point. Okay, sorry, I'm dense, maybe. I saw the number of people getting on board on the express lines. Some of those go into Stanford Industrial Park, Stanford Research Park. But I want to know if you have the number of riders that go, if you know how many people ride into Stanford Research Park on the 3 lines that are being either, the one is being cut entirely, and the 102 and 103, I believe, are being cut back. If you know the ridership on those. And then my comments are that I'm a little bit heartened. It sounds like there may be some wiggle room on Route 22. That it seems so crazy to cut that. I actually appreciate the expense of that route. It was very lucid, as our mayor said. Your explanations, which I very much appreciate. It is difficult to think of that. Have you done any outreach to employers along that route with shift workers at night? You know, there are at least 2 hospitals along that route who must have night workers possibly getting off during the night taking that. There are bars, there are restaurants, people closing down at 2 o'clock at night, customers, workers even later that would take that route. Has there been any outreach by VTA to those employers, to those hospitals?
To major institutions, yes. Individual businesses, no.
So they'll be left high and dry. They'll look up and their workers will just not have, so that's it. So I just have questions. Am I done talking? So many more questions, so many more comments. I want one more sentence. The city absolutely has to, if the Stanford Research Park lines are cut and the one disappears, whatever combination, we have to expect that the city has control at Stanford Research Park, a lot of control. We have to expect them to up their TMA. We have to insist that they mitigate the impacts of the parking and the traffic that will result if these cuts are made. So I have much more to say.
Thank you. Next speaker will be Priya Graves.
Good evening. I also want to advocate for keeping the 22 running at night. I have, on a number of occasions, come in from Southern California on Amtrak, and on some occasions it comes in on time, and on some occasions I have wound up at Dearborn Station after the last Caltrain leaves, and under your proposal, after the last 22 leaves, which would mean I would be stuck there until 4 a.m. And I don't really like that. I'm not homeless. I've lived in College Terrace in my house for more than 30 years, and I do use the 22 and 522 regularly. My husband and I both use the bus fairly late into the evening, and I realize that we're outliers, but we shouldn't be. We should all be on the buses rather than in our individual cars. And I'll tell you, the 522 late in the evening screams along El Camino. It's wonderful, but I think we still need to provide the safety net along that important spine of transit to run through all the way through all night. I would also like to suggest that the county look at ways of interconnecting the 522 spine into San Mateo better. The fact that if I want to go to Kepler's from from California Avenue, I have to take 2 buses, pay 2 fares, and deal with a much longer time than it would take me to drive. That's a huge disincentive for people to get out of their cars. So I think that's a place where we need to strengthen what VTA is doing. And finally, I would reinforce what Winter said regarding the impact on our local traffic and road usage, et cetera, if the service into the research park is cut. I'm very concerned about that. I do see those buses with a fair number of people on them going into the research park. I live in College Terrace, so research park is near and dear to my house and my heart. So I would ask you to look at that, and particularly from a standpoint of what the impact would be and whether mitigations are necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Marianne Michelle. Sorry.
I know it's not easy. And I'm here with some others, and instead of them speaking, there was some rule about if you represent 5 or 6 people, you get a few more minutes. Anyhow.
I'll give you my time.
Okay, I'm here with a group from Channing House. We represent about almost 200 riders, possible bus riders, and a support staff of employees that use the 35 and other buses. I'm pleased to say we have a 35 bus stop at each corner of our building. I was alarmed when I first read that you were going to cut it down from 30 minutes. I mean, up between rides. It's just 30 minutes, and that's okay, but not best. Now, my comment is not so much about the route, but what would make it easier to have more riders. And so I'm going to talk about older ones first. Thanks to the kneeling buses and accommodation of wheelchairs, walkers, and drivers who wait for us to sit down. Now let me mention the increased amount of walking. One of the most inaccessible stations is Palo Alto Transit Center, which has several stairways and ramps. The 35 does not stop on the San Francisco side train, and it doesn't stop. And it stops in the most distant parking slot on the San Jose side. You understand we have to go to different sides to get to San Francisco. Okay, so there's a lot of walking there. Palo Alto South Station has added a second ramp to cross the track, taking out an at-grade crossing that was most convenient. And Santa Clara Transit Stop provides many steps from bus to train and so forth. Mountain View has bus, train, and light rail without a single tunnel or ramp. If you ever use the bus, you may have never noticed these situations. Bus stops at shopping centers drop riders off as far as possible from the stores. Take Stanford Shopping Center. The bus stop is on Quarry Road, Arboretum, Sand Hill, and El Camino. That's outside. When Stanford Shopping Center was first built, the bus came to the center, into the center, and made a loop between the shops and the parking area. That loop is still there, and it starts on Arboretum and goes and empties on Sand Hill and El Camino. But buses aren't allowed on it. I don't think they're chic enough or something. But it's worth looking into, because it would certainly make it easier for people to shop if they could get off the bus close to the store. The new San Antonio Center is sort of the same way. The bus route is all around the center. It's close to Walmart. And there is in that area a road that goes from El Camino to California Avenue, right in the middle of it. I think the bus should be able to go through that and let people out closer to where they want to be. Towns and VTA should look for the best way to accommodate riders, and while short pickup times would be superior, bus routes that are planned to stop as close as possible to shops would be best. And would encourage people to leave their car at home, because if they didn't have as far to walk. I won't spend time telling you about the unprotected bus stop, but seats and protection from the wind, rain, and sun would not be so important if the bus ran every 15 minutes. But when you have to wait half an hour, it's not very good.
Now it's going to be an hour.
No, it's still going to be 30 minutes for us. The last thing I will mention are the empty slots above the windows of the bus. Ads posted by stores and restaurants along the bus route could go there. I do believe that would help PTA income. We are a huge community of people in North Santa Clara, and we need help getting out of our cars. And we voted for that measure that's given us money for frequent buses. We voted, all of us voted for it. And so we expect a little more. Let's see. I think that's enough.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Great. Barbara Bowden, please.
Just in case you have any doubts. I brought my Clipper card. I might have to take the bus home. I too live at Channing House, and I want to applaud Marianne Michaels' efforts to get people onto public transit. She makes sure we have schedules and things like that, but when you're changing the schedules, that makes another challenge. I really think that when I look at the map and I see the service routes, I understand the budget. I have an MBA. I understand how you have to figure out the cost per rider and per mile and all of those things. But I think you also need to look at where that income comes from. The service areas around San Jose are served now by BART and light rail and VTA. We have VTA and Caltrain, and that's it. If you want us as seniors to get out of our cars, theoretically that's much safer, but if I have to stand on the corner in the wind and the cold or the dark of night and wait for a bus or get in my car and drive, hey, it's not much of a contest. When I look at your map and I see the concentration of service in San Jose and the paucity of service in North County, taxpayers all, it's unconscionable that you're going to cut back on our service. If we ever need it, we need it now. If you care about the climate, if you care about safety, do not cut our service. In fact, if anything, you ought to be increasing it. I think your daycation program is excellent. I think there ought to be more publicity about that, and you ought to get more things doing about that. We get Clipper cards. We teach others to use them. Marianne does. I've taken to people to San Francisco and back from one corner of Channing House to the other, and they never got off anywhere but public transit, Clipper cards all the way. We work to support you, and our reward is a threat to cut our service. So it just seems unconscionable that we pay more in taxes and get less service.
Thank you. Next, Kay Shower.
I'll try to be very quick. I'm so glad you combined 35 and 32 to make 21, and that you will keep the same half-hour service. That is wonderful. I own a house here in Palo Alto, but within a month, I will be moving into Channing House. And one thing I would like to see happen is that your buses, 35, and I don't know which other ones, go to the train station. Now arrive 15 minutes after the train has left for San Francisco. So please, make a change on that.
Do we have Patty Irish?
I too am a resident at Channing House. You know, for a lot of seniors, it isn't even a choice about whether they can use a car. A lot of seniors have to give up their cars, and then they need public transportation. Palo Alto actually has a very large senior population. I mean, it is a growing population. It is a large portion of the city. And that's something I think very important to remember. I do agree with what the others have said. One, if it actually if it were more often, I think it would be used more. Now, because people need to go places and not wait so long, and the coordination, as people have said, it needs to fit with other forms of transportation. I also want to speak on behalf, I'm on the board of Stevenson House, and that's down on Charleston, very near Middlefield. That is another senior housing below with lower income, and they are very much dependent on public transportation. I do think we actually have a surprising number with the La Comida lunch program and all. We need to be aware we have a fairly sizable population, not just at Stevenson House, but who have moderate and low incomes. That's all the more reason why public transportation is extremely important. So I really hope that you'll hear this and help us to do even more. Thank you.
Thank you. Arthur Keller.
So thank you for having this meeting. I am Gunn High School Public Transit Coordinator and coordinate the VTA 88 bus with VTA and with the population of Gunn students. And actually, the history of the 88 bus routes, which run the 88, the 88L, and 88M, one bus picking people up in the morning going towards Gunn, on each one of these three routes, and one of each three routes picking them up in the afternoon in the other direction once a day at differing times, depending on the day. Was actually started about a decade ago. And that's because there was actually a student who fell off the back of a Palo Alto shuttle bus that went to Gunn High School because it was so full that they couldn't fit on the bus. And so we worked with VTA in the cuts that VTA did about a decade ago to get rid of the 86 bus. And they almost got rid of the 88 bus, but we kept it and added the 88 bus runs for Gunn. And so I'm glad that the VTA has worked with us. I've worked with Adam on that. And so that has been a very successful intervention. So we will continue that, and I'm glad to see that. But on the other hand, it's unfortunate that the other routes are being removed. The other runs of the 88 bus are being removed. There was talk several years ago of replacing it with a Palo Alto shuttle, and I think that's a discussion that the city has to have again, whether it will backfill the 88 bus loss with the Palo Alto shuttle that goes. There was talk about having an Embarcadero go along and then come down on West Bayshore and down Charleston and Astero to the VA. There was talk about that, and the design was done, but nothing has happened since then. We need to reconsider that. That design was because of the changes because of Next Network. Those changes have been deferred because of delays in the extension of BART, but now they need to come to the fore. I think that for between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., the loss of the over 100 people who are taking that route might be through subsidized lift service. And that might be cheaper and a way to handle that and not lose the service. The Stanford Research Park, I think that it's high time for the TMA, paid for by Stanford Research Park employers and not by the city, to subsidize those routes so that we can keep them. The 35 and 32 bus, which are being replaced by 21 bus, actually 35 ends the Mountain View Transit Center on Castro Street, not at San Antonio Transit Center. The shuttle here shows, the service here shows that as being zero. It's not zero. You should compare it to the 35 route now, as opposed to, or compare it to the Next Network plan, not compare it with zero. However, interesting, 7% of the sales tax from Palo Alto, so 7% of the county sales tax comes from Palo Alto. And we're not seeing anywhere near that amount in services back. And also, you talked about the paratransit cuts. We have seen cuts over many, many years since VTA was formed. There were multiple routes. The 86 route exists, the 84 route, the 88 route. There were multiple routes that existed and don't exist now today, because even though VTA promised when it was formed that we would not have cuts in Palo Alto service, we have seen repeated cuts. And there will be future cuts because when you raise prices and lower service, we do wind up with more lower revenue, and we will have a recession coming. So what are you going to do then? So it's not clear how you're going to handle future cuts when you're already going to a 90-10 plan. There's nowhere else to do. So maybe we should think about structural improvements, like, for example, think about merging VTA and Samtrans. Think about the idea that having the El Camino bus, the 522 and the 22, go all the way up to the into San Mateo and have a continuing run, rather than ending at Palo Alto, integrating the bus routes between Palo Alto and Menlo Park and San Mateo. Those are things we should think about, and that can be done through structural improvements of merging. We have balkanizations of transit agencies. We should merge them together in such a way to have actual savings in administration. Samtrans runs Caltrain as an administrative. We could merge with Samtrans and VTA and perhaps have administrative savings there that can allow for further increases in service. And I once again, I appreciate working with VTA and working with Adam. I've worked with you all the time, and I appreciate your cooperation in coordinating the 88 bus service, soon to be 288 bus service for Gunn High School. Thank you.
Thank you. And so thank you for that, and I wanted to make sure we got through that everybody who wanted to speak got a chance to speak. At this point, we're going to come back to the committee for more questions and comments, but if there's time after that, and I anticipate there will be, maybe we can take a few more questions from the audience if there's interest. Right? I don't want to go real late here, but
I just want to ask one thing. I'm assuming that the comments that we're making today will not be reported to the VTA board directly except by a letter from the mayor, and therefore people who are here may wish to continue writing letters to community outreach at VTA or the VTA board.
I've taken notes as frantically as I can. Of course, documenting it through an official comment is best, but I will do my best to represent this group's input.
Thank you.
okay. Councilmember Koo. Yeah, you want to lead us off?
Yes, sir. Is there anything you can do about the connection between the 35 bus and or the 21 bus and the Caltrain's schedule? You couldn't get them more further apart.
When we redesign a transit service from scratch, we get opportunities to redo all the timings.
I just asked if you could do anything about it.
Yes, I hope to do something about it.
Are we asking questions?
I was going to bring it back to policy and services. If you have a burning question you want to ask a question now, go ahead.
Questions later, I just didn't understand. I don't
Right.
mean to interfere.
Okay.
Mary Ann.
I'd like to give the committee a shot at it, and then we'll go back to the public. Right.
So thank you to both of you for being here tonight. Obviously, you see that there's a lot of concerns. I think on one end, we have the sustainability plan, not just for the city, but the entire California, where we're trying to reduce greenhouse gases. So I think that should be, for the board, VTA board, one of the top priorities. And if we can have, and obviously public transportation is a big part in that, getting people out of their cars, using public transportation. But again, as what you said, Adam, it is something that has to do with frequency and reliability, right? So I hope that you I know that as a planner you realize that, and I hope the board will realize that as well. So I think what they say in their goals has to match the action also. So I'm hoping that we can see that. And so in terms of questions, I'd like to find out, in the past, I know we have a few, ballot measures that went through where there were measures for tax revenue, et cetera. Can you give me kind of like an idea of how many we have out there that you're using to generate revenue that is still ongoing?
Certainly. The initial one was 1976. It is in perpetuity. It is a half-cent sales tax that is for transit. It runs the bus and light rail and maintenance and operation of those systems, and that is the one main primary source of the bus and light rail. We also, in 2000, passed Measure A, which has 14 different categories of allowable expenditures. One of those items is to support transit. So currently 20.75% of that half-cent sales tax does come into transit also for the bus and light rail. And that also goes towards that 80% that I mentioned earlier. So you've got the 76, you've got the piece coming from Measure A. As far as local measures, there's also 2008 Measure B, which is limited to operating and maintenance of BART and the capital cost of the BART system into Santa Clara County.
We remember.
Yes. And the fourth one is 2016 Measure B, which is the most recent tax that has the 9 different program areas, and it's a transportation tax, meaning that it has both transit and highway and bike and ped and Caltrain and multi-uses. I did miss the I hate to go back to 2008 Measure A, or Measure B, excuse me, but that's an 8th cent. And the most recent one, 2016 Measure B, is also a half-cent. And the last 3 that I discussed have 30-year life. So they do have a sunset.
You said 2008 is 8 cents?
1/8 cent.
1/8, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, thank you very much, Carol. Charleston Road. So we have, I think you heard all the discussion from, or the comments from the general public about some of the routes. But I see on Charleston where it is coming from, half of it is the high school. But there's the other half where somebody had mentioned about Stevenson House. How frequent are the routes over there? I think there's a 288, is that goes over there, or am I wrong in reading this?
So the 288 is a renaming of Route 88. We just wanted to classify all of our school routes in a 200 number series. So presently, Route 88, which runs along there, is I believe about a 45-ish frequency, some variation for when the driver gets a chance to take a break. In the future, our proposal is to only have those routes run around Gun High School bell times on days when Gun High School has service. So it would be significantly less frequent than it is today. It would not be an all-day route.
If it's not an all-day route, so what's the frequency going from one end of Arostadero to, I mean, from north to south or south to north, all along there? So let's not talk about the school ones for now. Let's talk about the ones that is from San Antonio, on Charleston, where the JCC is, all the way down to the end of Arostadero going to the Veterans Hospital. Is there any such
So
north and south connection then?
that's our current Route 88. So that is an all-day
Gonna be
route today.
288.
It'll become 288 and will become a service that only runs around Gun High School bell times in this proposal.
So the other half of Charleston is gonna have nothing. Is that,
That's correct. It would not have a VTA service on it. There are a few other services that operate through there by other agencies, but not us.
so from El Camino, so Charleston, I'm sorry, I just need to be clear. On Charleston, between El Camino and Middlefield, well, I see there's a green line, but from Charleston to the railroad, there'll be no service.
Everywhere you see a dashed line, it's where the service only exists for a small part of the day. So that could signify a service only for school or a service that is a peak period. So the green line you see, Route 104, is a peak period express route.
That's worrisome. Because we not only have a shopping center that is at the corner of Charleston and Middlefield, which a lot of the seniors from the senior home go to. Do we have shuttle services from Palo Alto, Sylvia or Ed? Oh, Ed just.
Shuttle services where?
On Charleston Road, you know, that services from Alma to the Charleston Shopping Center? You know, which passes through.
No, we do not currently have shuttle service there.
So that's going to be a void.
It goes close to there, because it goes to Stevenson House, right, which is like a quarter mile away or something like that, or half a mile?
Oh, sorry, yes, I'm sorry, I made a mistake.
Doesn't go to the
Yes,
it
it doesn't go up and down Charleston, but it does go from JLS through South Court, through the top of the circles there,
Right,
and goes to Stevenson.
right.
And then it comes back across town, Middlefield, all the way back to the transit center. So it goes in that, what I call north-south direction that way. But no, what Lydia's speaking about is
Right.
the part that goes towards El Camino.
Right.
No, we do not have a shuttle that does
That's
that.
unserved, right?
Yeah.
The shuttle is labeled in a kind of a greenish color.
Okay. And what's the frequency on our shuttle? 1 hour?
Sometimes, yeah, for the middle of the day. We have special school runs for the crosstown shuttle where we get an extra bus in for school times to service JLS and Green.
Okay. So, you know, I think, you know, connectivity is also important. So when I see that there's a spot on Charleston that is actually kind of, there isn't any service, then it kind of concerns me about that too. Next question is about functional needs people with disabilities. What kind of services are you providing? Is there any rapid transit or that sort?
So This transit service plan just governs where the routes go and the frequency of where they go. So it would not affect any special efforts that we do to serve disabled populations outside of whether they have access to transit or not. Our transit service team is in contact with a lot of social service providers, folks who work with disabled communities, and we've done what we can to preserve service in those areas. But outside of that, this effort doesn't touch that topic that much.
Yeah, all the other comments, a lot of people have already said it, so I see that you have already written them down. So, if can I come back if I think of more? Thank you.
Greg, you want to chime in on this?
Sure. So thanks for your presentation. I agree that it's actually a pretty clear presentation. Thank you. So I have some really basic questions. And so if you look at Palo Alto, how much do we contribute dollar-wise to VTA every year? Do you know?
That's not as easy of a question as you would think, and let me try to explain why. Palo Alto city tax is a Bradley Burns, the sales taxes that Palo Alto receives are Bradley Burns-based taxes. As a special district, the taxes we get are a different type. They're local sales and use taxes. The basic, easiest way to explain it is Bradley Burns is a point of sale based tax, and local sales and use taxes are a point of destination based tax. So one place where they can vary widely is online sales, or the example I like to give is car sales. I'm a resident of San Jose, but I bought a car in Oakland. The district tax was paid to VTA on that car because the car was registered in Santa Clara County and delivered to Santa Clara County. When the car dealer in Oakland fills out their tax forms, they're filling out that the district tax goes to Santa Clara County. They're not filling out that that the source of it was somebody who lived in San Jose. The same thing with online sales. They collect the district tax because the district tax is for the county, but when the information gets to the state and then ultimately comes to us, there's no designation of where that person lived or where it was shipped to, just that it was shipped to Santa Clara County. So that's why I try to never directly answer the question, even though I usually try to directly answer questions, because we honestly don't have that. Now, we've been asked the question in the past, and the best kind of proxy you can give is basically the number that you guys already have, which is the percentage of Bradley Burns taxes that are collected in Santa Clara County. The percentage that is collected in Palo Alto is around the 7% mark.
Well, do you know in terms of dollar amount, how much that is?
The 7%?
No, how much, so, for all the taxes that are collected from Palo Alto, right? How much is that in terms of dollars?
Well, except for we have no way of knowing how much is collected from Palo Alto. That's what I'm trying to say, because a decent portion of our sales taxes, we don't have the information as to where the individual lived who provided those taxes. So there's no way for us to give you an actual dollar amount, because we have a portion of our taxes that we don't have information
So
as to where that person resides.
But roughly 7% of revenue is from Palo Alto. Is that another way of saying it?
Well, let me try. So if I understand what you just said, there's a pool of sales taxes, the Bradley Burns taxes, where you know where it came from. And then there's another pool that's countywide that you don't know where it came from. But I think what Greg's trying to ask is, suppose you assumed that the proportion in the countywide pool was sort of similar to what it was in the other pool, in which case aggregate would be like 7% of both. But is it too much of an assumption to say if your budget's $500 million a year, then 7% of that came from Palo Alto?
You could use that as a proxy as long as you put a lot of caveats on it.
I think that's the number you're looking for, right?
Yeah.
Right, so that'd be,
Okay. So if I do 7% times, let's
Roughly
say
500 budget.
500 million, that's roughly what it is, right?
that would be an approximation.
Okay.
Yes, with all those caveats.
Okay, no, that's
yes.
fair. Okay, and then the other question, which hopefully is easier for you to answer, is how much does ETA spend on Palo Alto?
I'm going to put those two questions together because I think they're going in a place of, is what Palo Alto receiving in transit service equivalent to what Palo Alto contributes in terms of sales tax to the county? And I'll answer that in my profession, that is not the lens through which we look at.
No, I get it, but just to humor me, do you know what it is?
It would take a lot of research. I don't have that number
So
tonight.
you guys have no idea of how much you guys spend, and like, what if you did it by percentage of miles? So if percentage of miles traveled, what percentage of miles traveled are Palo Alto? So is it more than 7%? Is it less than 7%? What do you guys think?
That would be a big research project. I'd have to get back to you on that.
Okay, I think
It's
that's
probably a single-digit number, given Palo Alto's share of the county, area-wise.
okay, because if I look at this map, right, I mean, this map, I think so I forgot if someone mentioned that, it's pretty dense down here, right, down in San Jose.
There's a
And
lot
it's
of frequency there.
It's pretty light up here, in Palo Alto, right? And so, if it's evenly distributed, right, it's probably maybe is like 7%, but I mean, just the way this map's drawn, right, it looks like most of the routes are down here, right? And then not much routes up here. So I would think that that we are getting a lot less miles of transit than other areas. Well, obviously we are, but I don't think Palo Alto is a poor area, so I don't think that our contribution of sales tax are below normal. If anything, it's probably above normal. So to me, just looking at the picture, right, it would imply to me that we are. It doesn't seem like we're getting our fair share of transit. Is that a way of thinking about it, or is this picture just wrong here? Like, is there really more transit up here and we're just not seeing it?
To my previous response, when we think about spending money on transit service, we take the pot of money that we have in its entirety, and we look at how we think that can best be used within the county to achieve the goals given to us by our board of directors. So take an express route like Route 104. That brings people to jobs in Palo Alto, but it spends about 80% of its miles outside of Palo Alto. So is that to say that Santa Clara, which this route drives through, benefits from it, even though the route doesn't stop there? It becomes a really difficult question to answer whether the service expenditures and the revenues that come from a city match when you think about it in a regional context.
No, I hear you, and that's fair. But I also think about, like, what is the representation Palo Alto gets on VTA, right? I mean, we have a relatively low population, right? Our population it doubles during the day, essentially, but nighttime population is relatively small, and so in terms of votes on VTA, I don't know if we really get our representation. So it seems like, the more populous cities seem to get a bigger share of the vote, and thus they get a bigger share of the transit. That's my impression. But am I wrong about this, or because just looking at this map? I mean, this map is excellent because it really shows you where the money's going, right? And it shows the money's going down south, right? Most of it, at least from this picture here, right?
I hear you, and I would say that where transit service is located is in large part where there are strong transit markets, where there are demographics that correlate strongly with transit ridership, lower rates of home ownership, lower rates of vehicle ownership, vehicle access, minority status, recent immigrant status. Those sorts of things exist to a greater extent in those markets.
No, I hear you, but this country is founded on representation, right? I think wasn't there the tea tax thing that caused a revolution and whatnot, right? So, so to me, it just seems it's a long time ago, but it strikes me as equity, right? I mean, it seems like to me it would seem fair that the allocation of transit is by contribution, right? And if San Jose needs a lot more transit, they should pay for more, right? To balance it out, it shouldn't be Palo Alto subsidizing San Jose. Right? I mean, we're a tiny little city compared to San Jose. So that's what I'm trying to figure out, right? Because isn't it the saying like no taxation without representation? Is that the saying? So it's just I'm just trying to understand here like how that works.
So on our board of directors, there is a rotating seat in which Palo Alto shares a share of. So that's Palo Alto's representation on the board. You should have a member who is responding to your city's needs. And I apparently do not want to go there. And I hear the argument you're making, and I'm noting that the perspective of our agency in designing transit service is different, and we may end up talking past each other on this issue.
Well, I guess so. Can you guys swag it in terms of how much do you think Paul is spent on Palo Alto? Do you know any idea of your budget?
I'm not willing to say that because there are 10,000 different ways you could calculate it, and I'm
Well,
not going to throw a number off the top of
Pick
my
one of the
head.
10,000 ways. It's fine.
No.
Okay. I think the reason why you guys wouldn't do it is because if you did that, it would be incredibly unfair, right? I mean, just looking at the map here, it looks like Palo Alto gets maybe 1% of it, right?
I'm going to say that I'm not, it's not that I'm not willing to say it, it's that it's not the goal of a regional agency, and we are a county-wide agency, so.
If I might suggest, Councilmember, members of the committee, that, our guests from VTA perhaps best focus on your responses factually to the extent that you know, and again, the information that the committee members are asking for. Obviously, there's some policy questions that are being raised in terms of representation on VTA, and to your point, some of the underlying service goals of VTA. So perhaps coming out of tonight's discussion, there will be the communication to the board, and that's where the policy issues will best lie. And appreciate your willingness and ability to just provide the facts to the extent that those are known.
And I think you heard a hypothesis here on sort of the balance of revenues and expenditures that you might return to your board with.
Yeah.
Realize that's not really the goal of this meeting tonight. Is really looking at sort of the service plan, right? But since you are in the budget committee.
Yeah, I mean, to me, we're stakeholders, right? So it seemed to me that a report to the stakeholders of this is how much we invested in the community, this is how much you guys paid us. It's kind of balanced, right? I think that would be a good report to have. But maybe it's not balanced, but still, I think it would be good to talk about that and why it isn't balanced and why Palo Alto's exporting tax dollars. I think that would be a good thing to talk about. Okay. One of the members of the public, and I was actually thinking the same thing, it's actually quite interesting. So if you look at the slide, the slide that shows the cost per rider, I think it's strikingly high. So it's slide 26. So it's like $41 per rider, right? And I take Uber and Uber Pool and Lyft Pool, all that stuff quite frequently, actually. And I could tell you the price of the subsidies are high enough where somebody could just order one of the car shares and get there faster, more conveniently than these subsidies. These subsidies are huge, right? It's like we could pay for someone's ride. So I think the member of the public that talked about that is actually observant, because I was thinking that, heck, maybe that's what we should do, right? Maybe instead of shoveling money to VTA, what we should do is, because I know like the city of Las Vegas, what they do in downtown is they'll pay for your Uber or Lyft ride there. It's free. So the ride there is free, and the ride back, well, you have to pay for that yourself, but the ride there is free. And the level of these subsidies are huge, right? From $28 to $24, $41, $35. It's massive. I mean, I could go to San Francisco on an Uber Pool for this amount of money.
Yeah, perhaps I can provide a little bit of history here that can be helpful. Up until about 2014, the federal government gave us grants to help subsidize these long-distance trips. The thing they wanted to encourage was lots of people traveling in a bus, being more space efficient on the roadways. It was a congestion goal there. But around 2014, that revenue stream stopped. And so VTA has been paying a greater share since then. So when these routes were created, the financial environment was a little different and these numbers weren't so big, but
Sure.
we're facing big numbers now, certainly.
Yeah, I guess I'm just reflecting on, given that most people have a smartphone these days, right, and the rise of Uber and Lyft and all that, to me, it just seems like it kind of questions, especially for these low ridership routes. I mean, we could maybe the better answer is to do what like Las Vegas did or other cities are doing, where they just basically will pay the subsidy to the car share, versus trying to run a bus with one person on there. So, have you guys looked at that at all?
We have considered what kind of alternate options you could have. Of course, Carol's sitting here telling me that I need to trim the budget, so any subsidy we take and start giving to a car share is, going to make her kick me under the table.
Yeah.
So there's an extent to how those solutions might be implemented, and they certainly would have a cost to VTA if we're subsidizing those trips.
But I think Greg's point here is actually quite interesting, because your discussion of the express routes, which I thought was very, very clear and helpful, right? Basically, if I understand what you said, you basically have enormous fixed costs on each one of these routes, right? Mm-hmm. For small amounts of time. And I assume those fixed costs are where these numbers come from. So if you went to an alternate service delivery mechanism, such as Greg's suggesting, you wouldn't have those fixed costs, in which case you actually might be able to realize savings like this, right? I think that's what you're saying, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just other cities seem to have recognized that, and so I just wonder, like, maybe it makes sense here too. Okay, so so the other thing that I've been thinking about is, it looks like, just looking at your lower budget here, that your expenses are growing much, much faster than your revenue. And I can understand that, because we have the same issue here. So how much of that expense is the cost of the driver?
I think there's maybe two questions here. So the cost of operating transit service, an hour of transit service, is about 85% of that is labor. So that's the driver and that's the maintenance on the vehicle. In terms of an overall budget staffing number, is that what you're curious about?
No, I'm looking for the driver. And let me tell you where I'm going on this. So, everyone sees the autonomous cars driving around, right? And one of the big things that people talk about in terms of one of the first markets for autonomous driving is maybe autonomous buses.
Sure.
And so I wonder is, as that technology rolls out, and it probably roll out probably first in autonomous bus or long-haul trucking, right, versus personal vehicle. Probably, don't know. I just wonder, like, how does that equation change, right? And so I'm just trying to understand from you guys, like, that's why I'm curious to know, how much is the cost of the driver? So if the driver is like 85% of the cost, okay, that just changes the equation a lot. But if the cost of the driver is like 1%, then okay, it doesn't really matter. So that's what I'm just trying to think about, like, how does this change the future?
Right, I appreciate the line of thinking. Autonomous technology could have a big impact on VTA's labor cost. If we don't need someone to drive the bus, obviously there's a big savings there. I would caution that idea, thinking that it's probably going to be good to have some VTA employees still on board the bus in sort of an ambassador sense, a security sense, something like that.
I guess
it could be a cost savings.
I'm just trying to figure out how much is a driver right now. Do you know?
Our overall hourly cost for a bus is about $180, taking in all the overhead. Mm-hmm. So about 85% of that would be shared between the driver and the maintenance workers.
Do you know what is between maintenance and driver?
I don't know precisely that. Okay. Majority driver.
Majority driver. Okay. Okay. So it would be significant then if buses became autonomous.
Yes, it would be a big game changer.
Okay. And then I guess my question is more to this committee here. We are the Policy and Services. So what I wonder is, we used to have our bus system, right? And at some point in time, we kind of gave it over to VTA. And what I wonder is, because what I wonder is like, was that such a good deal? Could we take it back? I mean, could we go back the other way and do, pay for our own bus system again? Because it seems like we would get more out of it. Because I mean, this map's so damning, right? You just look at the map and you see, it seems like all the routes are down south, and we know we're certainly paying our fair share of the sales tax. So it's like, I mean, what I wonder is, if we wanted to, how could we unwind this, right? How could we say, okay, VTA, you guys need to serve San Jose, go for it, right? And then we kind of do our thing here, so we can actually make sure that we solve some of the transit issues. Because, you know, our residents here in Palo Alto, I know that you guys think, oh, you know, everyone's rich in Palo Alto, so we don't need to serve Palo Alto very well. But, you know, there's also a lot of traffic and parking issues here, right? And transit is one way to solve that. So that's why I think there's a lot of people clamoring for better transit solutions. So this is maybe, I don't know if you guys know the answer, but like, what is the, are we bound for this for life, or can we opt out? Like, what's the option here?
I think that's above the pay grade of everybody in this room.
Not qualified.
Not qualified. Okay. Okay. Well, I mean, I for one would think that unless we rectify the issue of outgoing dollars being a lot higher than incoming dollars in terms of service, I can't see us trying to contribute any more, at least willingly, to VTA, because I think we have to fix the representation issue. We can't be outvoted by San Jose every day, right? We have to be able to figure out to keep the dollars here in Palo Alto to serve the people here in Palo Alto. So I for one would never support. I know you guys have a budget shortfall, but I would not support trying to use extra dollars from Palo Alto to help VTA until we figure out the representation where there could be more equity in terms of what we pay and what we get. But I don't know if my other members feel differently. Maybe they feel like we should do the other way around. But I think we should keep the dollars here in Palo Alto.
Koo, you got a couple more?
Thank you.
I have a couple too, so
Okay.
I'll go after you.
I just want to clarify, VTA, you guys also have BART, so you fund BART as well, and you maintain BART. Is that so?
So BART is its own independent transit agency, but VTA has been raising funds locally through sales tax measures to pay for the extension and some of the operating assistance for the BART extension down into Santa Clara County. So BART is its own agency with its own governing board.
And then VTA just
We
just did that one section.
Our jurisdiction is Santa Clara County, and so we've been the engine behind bringing BART into our county with funding.
And then how are you guys at this point collaborating with Samtrans, or is it just, is there any collaboration in terms of ongoing, continuing service, including the 522 route? Or
You know, one of the challenges that we face is the arbitrary nature of the borders between jurisdictions. In Santa Clara County, we have our own taxes collected locally that pay for our service, and Samtrans has a similar arrangement. And it becomes difficult politically, especially when we're in a budget savings mode, to justify operating service outside of our own county with tax dollars that are collected in our county. The result is that you get this really disconnected result along county borders. We have the same thing with Alameda County. So we have a professional relationship with Samtrans, but you rarely see either of our services coming into the other's jurisdiction because of the financial situation that we're under.
And so what is the distance between your last bus stop here in Palo Alto at the border, and what is the next one that somebody would be able to get onto in Menlo Park on the other side of the border?
We meet Samtrans at the Palo Alto Transit Center, so they
At the
come
Palo
just
Alto
barely
Transit
into our
Center.
county.
Okay.
And then there's transfers get made there.
Well, that's good to know. Oh, so I know you gave the figure of how much the bus driver, right? How much to run a bus?
So,
Like, say, for example, from our transit center to the end of town.
we would measure the trip in terms of time. So 1 hour of bus service that VTA provides costs $180. That's
Okay,
factoring in all
so-
the overhead costs. If we were to add one more hour, the marginal cost would be about $120 because some of that overhead's already taken care of.
What's the life of a bus?
A bus that's put into regular usage can last about 12 years.
That's the big ones, right?
40-footers and 60-footers. VTA has some great mechanics that have been able to stretch that a little bit longer and save us some money, but 12 years is the manufacturer's recommended life.
12 years, okay. So thank you.
Thank you. So I had a couple, so again, thank you. I had a couple questions too. So start with a couple of the gearhead questions and then, right. But, so one of the things you're looking at is you're looking for about 7 million in cost savings and operating efficiencies, right? If I'm looking at this one?
Are you looking at the bottom number?
I'm looking at the bottom number, yeah.
Yes.
Right. So I'm going to guess if your total budget is 500 million, then wages and the labor, the human component of that is maybe 2/3 of that or something like that.
It's right around 62%, so yeah, you're close.
That's in line with ours, right? So I'm just guessing.
Yeah, it's a service, as a service agency, labor is always going to be your biggest component.
And so that's where I think you indicated you thought maybe the 7 million could come from is sort of in, right.
Some of it is there, some of it is just other cost efficiencies that we can identify, but yeah,
Right.
some of it would need to be bargained, yes.
Bargained for, yeah, of course. So that's, the 7 million amounts to about 2%, 2% of, 62% of 5 million, it's something like that, right?
Roughly,
500
yeah.
million, so it's a couple percent. So I was sort of looking at where
It's the
was
first
it?
slide, probably.
It's probably, yeah, it is the first slide. Thank you very much. You know where I'm going.
The really colorful one,
Right.
yes.
The color chart here.
Uh-huh.
So if I understand this right and I add up, so your total expenses in FY18 are 525, and your total expenses in FY22 are 587. And so that's about a 12% increase over 4 years, so something like 3% a year.
In the range, yes.
That's pretty good because our costs are going up faster than 3% a year, right? But you're going to hold the costs to 3% of your growth, including cutting 2% out of your labor?
Well, there are several components that come out of that. One is the service changes that were,
But that's just the seven.
No, that's
okay,
the
no,
that's the 15.
You're assuming
That's the 15.
You're assuming the service changes are in here too. Okay.
right, the service change comes out of there, so the roughly 15 million that we
Mhm.
save from the service change.
Mhm.
Some of those $7 million in,
But if you're including the service changes in here, it still doesn't balance in FY22.
but there's more revenues also. So we're not just cutting, we're not just reducing the expenses in the out years, we're also increasing revenues in the out years to get the delta. But the other
You mean
thing,
beyond FY22?
well, starting actually now,
But
some of the
what-
revenues,
What am I not looking at? Because it doesn't look like they balance.
well, this was the projection at the time. This is not updated.
Okay.
This is what it looked like when the
okay.
budget was
Without the-
adopted
okay,
in
okay.
June of 2017.
I see.
Right, so these are not current projections. Yeah, I can see now why the confusion, yes. No, these were the projections at the time that we did the budget, which is what made us step back and say, wait, this is, I mean, it wasn't just this that made us step back, but this made it very clear that this was not a sustainable path.
Okay.
If the service that was assumed in the FY18 and 19 adopted budget had been implemented when it was assumed to be implemented, at that rate of speed, we would have been out of reserves in 18 months to 18 to 24 months. So the delay in BART didn't change whether it was going to happen, it just changed when it would have happened. But it gave us time to regroup, look at, okay, we need to rebalance the ship here so that we don't go off this cliff. I mixed a couple of metaphors in there somewhere, but so that was the impetus here. So this does not reflect what it would look like if we do all of these things. The 20 and 21 budget, which will come to the board in a couple of months, will be balanced at worst, a small surplus,
Okay.
potentially, yeah.
Okay, okay. Well, that would be welcome.
Yes, very much so.
One more question. This will be a bit of a rat hole, okay? But are you guys a CalPERS agency?
We are.
So,
Part of us are. We have two. Our drivers, our ATU union, which is the largest portion of our employees, it's about 1,200 it's about half, I think, of our employees have their own pension plan.
okay,
The other three bargaining units and the non-represented employees are in CalPERS.
okay. So, I'm sure Ed's chuckling down there, right? But if you're not at 6.2% as your discount rate, then you're not fully funding your future pensions, and your pension costs are going to continue to explode no matter what CalPERS tells you, right? And I assume that this is based on CalPERS numbers, and they're wrong, right? So,
Parts of it
FYI,
are a
FYI.
valid point.
FYI.
Fair enough.
I actually wanted to follow up on Winter's question earlier, which was, can you explain the gun lines again?
Yeah, be happy to. Let me jump over to the charts. So we have the Route 88, which is the all-day route going from northern Palo Alto down to the VA Gun High School area. And we know that there's such a demand from gun students that we put 2 extra buses on that route to carry them. And in working with the school, and Arthur may be able to provide better history on this than I can, but we've come up with a variant. So you have your 88, which is the all-day. You have the L, which takes a little bit different of a route from the 88, and the M. So that way we can sort of fan out from Gun High School and cover a little more geographic area and make those walks shorter for those students. So we would keep those in this proposal. Instead of it being the 88, 88M and 88L, they would be the 288, 288M, 288L, but it would be the same sort of concept of 3 routes that fan out from the school into northern Palo Alto. But the proposal is just to keep them around the bell times, because that's when the demand surges on this route.
Right, but you don't anticipate route changes, for example, and they're going to go slightly different places or anything like that versus now?
We collaborate with the high school on where the routes go, and we've made small changes over the years based on their input. Is that fair, Arthur?
Yeah, that's fair. There was also a discussion at the Next Network, so.
I got him going.
Yes, that's fair. There was also discussion as part of the Next Network that a fourth school tripper would be provided going from Gun High School at home towards homes, and I'm not sure if that's still a potential or if that's on the cutting board.
Did not make it into this proposal, just the 3.
So there was a fourth, so the Next Network had a fourth, which was unspecified to be determined, and that's also being cut. Is that my understanding is correct?
I was not aware that there was a 4th plan in Next Network. It may have just been something that was discussed, but I don't believe it ever made it into our planning document, and it's not in this plan.
I can go back through my archive. I can go back through my archive and find it for you.
You want to chime in? Go ahead. Yeah, you probably ought to get it to the mic, right?
In our meeting with VTA board member John McAllister, he mentioned 4 from Gun, and that's all I know, that assured that there were 4 routes, bell time, afternoon bell time from Gun. So maybe that is something that could get just confirmed one way or another. Please.
Is that consistent with your?
It's possible that I'm mistaken on this. I am not the point person for dealing with Gun High School on this, so I can check with them.
That would be great. Thank you. I wanted to ask, on the subject of Route 22, I'm glad we talked about this a little bit. I understand the issue with, sort of the shelter of last resort of Route 22, right? I'm glad you guys are working with other sort of parts of the county to try to figure out a solution to that. From our perspective, I think as a couple of people here pointed out, Route 22 also serves a fairly sizable number of shift workers, of low-income shift workers. It's their last resort, that work very late night shifts and so forth, and the risk is that they'll be stranded. And there's a sizable number of them, right, I think. Somebody asked a question about how many riders ride the express ride to SRP. Do you guys actually, I was going to take a whack at it, but do you guys actually have that handy? Okay,
I've got a giant spreadsheet here. I'd have to do a little bit of math for you. Give me a few minutes at the end of the meeting. I'll get you that number.
Okay, thanks. I was just going to guess it's half a dozen a day times, looks like, maybe 5 or 10 an hour, and there's 4 different lines, so 150 to 200, is that ballpark?
I'd guess somewhere in the 200 to 400 range is probably where we are.
North of that, okay. Okay, good.
Is that morning and, is that round trip? I'm sorry.
Is that both directions?
Total unique people.
So both north and south? 2 trips per person?
2 trips per person, so double that number to
Right.
400 to 800 total boardings carried on those routes.
Okay.
And that's an estimate before I do the math. And a
And
range.
a range.
Is it okay if I do this 2 SRP?
It's okay. It's okay.
Looking at the 4 routes,
To Stanford Research Park, coming into Stanford.
To and from. To and from.
let's not quote me on that number. Let me do the math after the meeting.
He's gonna do some magic. Right. And you said earlier, and somebody picked up on this, and maybe you could put just a little bit of color. You said, well, one of the issues is your sort of feeling is that you want to preserve service in places where there aren't a lot of transit alternatives, right? And what alternatives are you thinking about for North County that exist that don't exist elsewhere? If you have something off the top of your head.
Well, I'll note that we are constrained by the direction here of 90% on ridership purposed routes and 10% on coverage purposed routes. So there's an extent to how far we can stretch the dollars in our budget. There is, in the 2016 Measure B, there is a pot of money. I believe it's $1.5 million a year to First Last Mile Innovative Transit Solutions. And that is a grant program that VTA is currently developing the framework for, that cities would be able to apply for to do something in their jurisdiction using these funds that would solve those first last mile type problems. And that could be something like Uber and Lyft subsidies, taxi vouchers. If a city would like to run its own shuttle, that would be an eligible service. So as we get that framework together in the coming months, we're going to be talking with your city through all of our committees to let you know how to apply for that. It would be a competitive process.
So we could apply for some of that grant money?
Yeah, that's the idea.
Okay.
Are you speaking to our city manager, or is it coming from committee?
We are developing the framework at VTA. Our connection with the cities is through our policy advisory committee, our technical advisory committee, so consisting of your city representative from your council, as well as your technical staff who attends. So the word should be getting out there.
I think this has been really helpful. As you've heard tonight, and you already know, there is a need for good public transit in the North County, right? And both in Palo Alto and Mountain View, and actually the dialogue about sort of interchange with San Mateo cities and so forth is relevant in all this. But we have a need for public transit like everybody else, and as you heard, there are a sizable number of seniors, for example, that are on low and mid income in this city. We have a lot of people that aren't Mark Zuckerberg in this city, right? And depend on public transit, and as you heard, there are some significant gaps, right? You cover some of that. We have a little bit of shuttles up here. Obviously Stanford runs the Margarita, as you know, and so forth. So there's a little bit of other stuff there, but it's not anywhere near the coverage that we'd like to get when you put it all together. And we have a need for that, right? On the subject of, transit alternatives, if, for example, you were thinking about our crosstown shuttle as a transit alternative, you know, that's something that we fund out of our general fund. So the irony of Councilmember Tanaka's hypothesis that maybe there's not a balance in revenues, expenditures, and we further shift that by running a few of our own shuttles at the same time, and that counts as an alternative a transit alternative, which means that, you know, you can direct other funds to this. There's a positive feedback nonlinearity in here somewhere. Okay, so I think that's a concern to us. So we need to we have a need for this kind of service in our county, right? And so I hope there's going to be a resolution to this kind of stuff. Yeah. And the irony of going back to Councilmember Tanaka's hypothesis about sort of an imbalance that, you know, we go through the grant process to get some of that back as Orwellian, right? So with that, I think we're all happy that there was some confusion on the Route 35 that seems to have been a miscommunication on our part, so I'm very glad to hear that. You know, I think we still have concerns, as you've heard, about Route 22, which I'm glad you guys are looking at, right? It would be unfortunate to turn the express routes back into people to 400, 800 car trips through the streets of the county, right? In many cases, the length of the county, right? On that. But other than that, very much appreciate you folks coming out, and this is a much better picture than we had before. Is there anything else from the audience? We have, I think we ought to be done by 8, right? And so if there's a couple more questions from the audience, we could do that if that's okay with you folks, if you can stay another 10 minutes, and then we'll wrap. Is that okay? And I actually saw that lady's hand up before yours, Arthur, right? So if that's okay, right?
My question. Yeah, I yelled at you to use the mic. Take my directions here.
You'd say Marky.
I would say
Not
that
totally.
cutting the routes and decreasing the frequency becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You will have fewer riders and less contribution because you have less service. So if you're going to ask us as seniors to encourage our peers to ride public transit, you have to provide the service. The other thing is that Palo Alto is pushing our city council and our planning people to put in higher density housing, and if there's not transportation for them, they're all going to drive cars. And we're going to leave our grandchildren and great-grandchildren a pretty lousy climate to live in. We take that very seriously, looking down the road. So if we're going to put in denser housing, you have an obligation to provide us with public transportation to keep those cars off the road. It's a moral imperative, and it's not just a matter of the budget.
Thank you. Arthur.
Yes, so firstly, there was a question on whether an express bus that originates in, say, San Jose and terminates in Palo Alto or vice versa benefits, say, the city of Santa Clara or the city of Sunnyvale. And the answer is, presumably, if we didn't have that bus and those cars were driving through those cities, they would be hurt by those additional cars on the freeway, if not on their roads. So that's one thing to consider. And in particular, if you're talking about 400 cars being added, modulo your calculation of exactly how many that is, that adds 2% to the amount of cars that are driving on Charleston or Astero Road, because most of them would probably take Charleston Astero Road off of 101 to get to the Stanford Research Park. And therefore, that 2%, since it's partly at saturation, would increase delay considerably, because when you approach saturation, you increase delay. So in terms of the budget, what is the total sales tax rate that goes to VTA in terms of all 3 or 4 sales taxes?
Can I ask that question back to you a little bit differently? Do you mean, because how much we collect for those 4 taxes and how much goes towards the transit budget are 2 different answers.
Okay, so tell me first the total rate, that's total.
Okay, total would be, should never have to add in my head, it doesn't end well. 1625, I believe.
So 1 5/8.
Yes.
Okay, and the second thing is do you know what percentage of, how many points of that? So it's 1.625 or 1,625 basis points. Do you know how many basis points might be going towards transit uses, including BART?
Not off the top of my head, because I'd have to carve out the pieces of the measures that go somewhere that's
probably
transportation.
pretty complicated calculation, probably.
It's, not as easy as it sounds on the surface.
But one might expect that it would be at least 1%, possibly 1 1/4.
Yes, it's at least 1% because the full half cent for 76, the full half cent for 2000 Measure A goes to transit projects. So if you're defining transit, not just BART, but
All
light
transit.
rail, Caltrain, everything, that's a transit tax. The 1/8 cent is 100% transit. The one that's not is the newest one, 2016 Measure B has components that are not transit. So that's the one that I'd have to think a little bit about. But yes, it's definitely over 1 because you have 2 half cents and 1/4 and an 1/8 cent, that are transit related.
So it's likely north of 1 1/4%.
Yes.
So do you know what the total revenue is in terms of sales tax revenue at the 1.625% or whatever percentage you want to give me?
You're going somewhere with all this, right, Arthur?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Sorry, just a second.
We're primarily discussing route changes, not
No, I understand, but
refinancing the
I'm
VTA.
addressing.
360,
$360 million?
yes.
360 million, okay. So that's the 1.625. And 1.25 would be about 80, about 2/3 of that, approximately?
Yeah, just under 280.
280, so that'd be about $280 million. And so that is essentially, if you want to calculate the 7%, if you're assuming that 7% of sales tax comes from Palo Alto, then you take the 7% of 280 million. That's what I was trying to get that number from. Now, presumably, you said that there are 2 kinds of sales taxes, and the sales tax that Palo Alto gets is from Palo Alto residents buying from Palo Alto stores?
Or anyone buying from us.
Anybody buying in Palo Alto stores?
Purchased in Palo Alto, yes.
Right. And in addition, there's sales taxes that come from people who buy out of county or out of or mail order, and therefore those are not attributable to the first count, and therefore the amount attributable to Palo Alto, if you could actually calculate, would actually be greater than 7%, if that's the number of ratio.
No, that's not the 7% is the amount of the Bradley Burns taxes, wherever they come from, and it's that go to Palo Alto.
Right.
So that doesn't mean that the online is a add-on to the 7%, if that's what you're.
No, what I'm saying
at.
is the 7% is based on the denominator, that's the Bradley calculation for Santa Clara County. However, since the other things is added to the numerator and the denominator, that it would actually be higher because the denominator is larger. But I'll get to that later. So when you have a network system, the edges of a network tend to have lower ridership, just because they're at the edge. It has nothing to do with whether there is in density at that edge. Just because it's at the edge, it has low ridership. And I'm supportive of basically providing things for South County, but I think that should be considered in terms of all of the edges of the network should be considered in terms of support, not just South County. And it's basically based on math, if you will. Now, here's a hypothetical. Let's suppose that Palo Alto's population is about 65 million. Were to instantly tomorrow double to 130 million. I mean, 130,000. Okay? If you went to 130,000 people in Palo Alto, double the population, would we see any increased transit service in Palo Alto other than the 22 or 522 bus?
Probably.
Probably? You think so?
Yes.
So in Mountain View is increased population, projecting to increase population by 20% in the next few years based on the growth they're doing. Are they getting any increased transit service from that?
I couldn't give you a precise number, Arthur, but we update our transit service plan every 2 years, generally with small changes, and those are in response to changes in demand where we see land use intensification justifying greater service. So places that are adding density, especially along transit corridors, are likely to be rewarded with higher levels of transit service.
So based on Mountain View's dramatic increases in growth, are they seeing any increases for Next Network, or are they seeing any increases from the 2019 service plan?
Well, the Next Network plan was never implemented. I think you're asking a question that has so many variables in it, I couldn't give you a precise answer.
Based on my reading the Next Network plan that was not implemented, it didn't have any increases for Mountain View, and I don't see any in the 2019 plan. So that would basically say plan development in Mountain View has not increased any development. Let me close with one.
Yeah, I think, as I was going to say, I think Mountain View is actually putting some of their own shuttles, their own transportation into the North County.
That's right. They're putting a lot of shuttles paid for by Google.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Good.
Right.
You have 1 minute left, by the way. We have.
Great.
We have 1 minute left here.
So what I will say is Los Angeles County basically threw up their hands about providing local service. They're providing long spine service, like 22, 522, and they're providing regional service like the 21 bus. But they gave up on providing local service. But what they did instead is they basically gave each municipality a pot of money saying you run it yourself. And I think that that's something that VTA should consider, because especially at the edges of the network that are essentially hard to sustain that service, VTA should basically providing to the edge of the network money to provide their own local services. And I'm not sure if it would go fully towards equalizing the point that Councilmember Tanaka brought up, but it would go somewhat towards that. It would be a good faith effort to basically say, we're not going to provide that service. We're never going to provide that service because of the low ridership. You provide that service, and and VTA will help subsidize that. Thank you.
Thank you. We are now at 8 o'clock, and so.
How we're going to find out the answers? There are just a couple, 2, 3 questions hanging out. How we'll find the answers?
Suggestion on that?
Relaying them to the city and how then I can find out.
I'm happy to have a conversation after this directly with you on those specific questions. I don't know which ones you're referring to.
I think that our mayor actually pretty much re-asked my questions, just so how will they filter out to we the people your answers? Because you're going to answer to the city, and then how do we find those answers? I'm just asking the process.
We are going to accept all of the input that comes in, comments from cities and comments from the public alike. And in my role, and my team's role, is to advocate to our board of directors based on what we're hearing, changes that we think make sense. So some of that is public sentiment, some of that is based on observed ridership data, where we think we can meet the board directive to try to achieve greater ridership. So there's a lot of factors that go into that, and I'm sure there's going to be a political element to coming up with what the solutions are. We will be as transparent as possible about our reasoning when we release a final plan in April for the VTA committees to consider.
I only have written down one question that we're sort of waiting for an answer on, which was what's the ridership on the express bus lines? I'm not
combining.
Did you have another one?
Well, you actually asked two, Mayor, specifically to have confirmed. One was the ridership into Stanford Research Park, and the other one was to confirming the 3 or 4, well, I guess we asked, the 3 or 4 buses on PM ridership
Right.
buses from Gunn. Was it 3 or 4? Because there's some confusion.
And
Those two questions.
what specifically was,
What happened
to
to
be,
the fourth bus that was the next network plan?
I will follow up on that fourth bus question.
how should we get an answer to that?
Exactly.
What is the best way for me to contact the city?
You can send it to.
Send it to the city manager?
To the city manager and copy me.
Okay, happy to do that.
Thank you very much.
For the question about VTA express buses that are going into the Stanford Research Park area, the total that I found is 504 unique passengers, which is, or let me make sure that I have this correct. 504 total boardings, so that's 252 different
way.
individuals. I would note, though, that while that is potential trips that do not occur on the road, if those funds could be reinvested in a place where instead of paying $30 or $40 per trip, we can pay $6 to $10 per trip, that's potentially a lot more people that can use transit and get out of their cars. So while it may mean more congestion, more cars on the highways, it could be less cars in other places.
And that is round trips, excuse me, is that 504?
200.
Meaning a round trip total?
252 round trips, 540.
Thank you.
So there's an opportunity cost with how VTA spends its money. If we pay $40 per boarding for an express route, that is one person getting out of their car potentially for $40. If we instead reinvest those funds elsewhere in our network, our average cost is around $8. That's 5 people we could carry for that money. So those are potentially trips where someone is not using an automobile to get around. They may not be as long, they may not be on the highways, but there is a trade-off there. Just the trips you don't see on the road come from a different source.
And would not be reduced trips going through Palo Alto. They'd be reduced trips going through San Jose probably.
Good. With that, thank you folks very much again for coming out here and do this. You knew we were going to be kind of a tough crowd, and you came out here anyway and so forth. So
Yeah, thank
many,
you so
many
much.
thanks for that. Right, and much appreciated. With that, we are adjourned.